Hi there, guys. Good morning. Today is actually the part two of our discussion for global cities. As our discussion last week pertains to the concepts of migration and emigration in terms of course, coming into play for global cities. So this is actually the second part, which describes actually the history of cities and how they have arrived to become who they are today. Okay, so let me begin by sharing to you the discussion or the presentation that I have for global cities. Okay, for a while. Okay, so this is actually my discussion about global cities. So first and foremost, how do you become a global city? So you describe it first as okay, a global city is a city which actually has an important impact on global economy and society. So, for example, you have the likes of London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, New York, and Chicago, which are the main global cities in the world. And this discussion will entail for us to see the history of why they became such global economies and became very influential. If you're familiar with the New York Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange. So these are some of the business hubs or the start of industrialization in these countries. So we begin by, of course, describing that in 1800s, or usually the population, or when we say, and the city. So here, usually you have 10% from the 1800s down to your current, which is a 75% index, wherein you have cities or urban cities. So 3% lived in cities in the 1800s. Well, now the population after the millennium is easily 75% to 80%. So let's see. The next one is actually a composite image or satellite image in NASA captured in the year 2000, showing the density of the entire globe in terms of urbanization. So usually when you say global cities in the 1940s or from the 1800s to the 1940s, we basically describe here why do cities matter to global history and why or what are the patterns of the city growth and the urbanization over time, and usually the questions about what roles industrialization and empire building play in all of these aspects. And the city is ancient, but of course, since you see it's 1800s and 1914, it's also the cradle of modernity. So there's urban sociability, urban planning, and urban politics. So what's the differences between this? Also, it matters because urbanization is of course described in the transformation of population structures and urban ratios. So it's usually when you say urbanization, it is a process that is usually distinct or the for urbanism, urban cultures, which is distinct ways of life experienced by dwellers or by city dwellers. So in the 19th century, there were dramatic changes seen in terms of the urbanization or the urbanism because the language is saturated by the heritage of the cities and the civilization, the politics, the bourgeois, because normally in growing France, we have the bourgeois, which describes the identity of people back then. And then of course there are sports, and of course when you study cities, it's actually challenging because normally, like what in the first concept, but described as demographers and sociologists. They vary in definitions and also in approaches in terms of the systems and the networks that describe each one of these cities. So the urban growth or the ratio is the increase in the absolute size of cities and normally the increase of the city dwellers. So we are, or for example, if your area is declared a city, we are city dwellers. So this is actually a study of a map of the Europe in the 19th, in the 16th and in the 19th century. Okay, so if you notice on the left side, it's 16th century, so very dense population. But then when it reached 1900s or the 19th century, there's almost half of it, or almost a million people are actually living in Europe by that time. So in 1800s, let's compare. Let's try to see. Okay, so this is actually according to a writer or Jürgen Osterhammel. And he describes the global history of the cities in the 19th century. So Beijing, London, you have there Beijing as 1.1 million city dwellers, down to Tokyo to 1.5 million, and Philadelphia 1.42 million. Okay, so these are the what you call it's not actually ancient, but it's actually they describe it as these are the first cities that are recognized. So in the early modern urban system, cities are important out of proportion to their size, creativity. For example, there are Renaissance city-states like Paris, mercantile wealth like in London because of the industrialization or factories that were there. Of course, Antwerp. There's also ceremonial powers in Beijing, the maritime or imperial projections in Liverpool and Macau, because Macau is surrounded by water and Liverpool is seen as that one. So urban archipelagos are, for example, in agrarian cities, there are diverse types and there are, of course, political centers. So when you say mercantile, it means there's the center of or mercantile depots, such as, of course, London again, and entertainment cities, like, for example, what happened, like the example is Hollywood. Okay, so there are early industrial cities. So why do they grow? Because of migration from rural population down to, of course, going into the city. So the common challenges normally are during that time with a more of an urban system, it's usually unhealthy and disordered, and of course, difficult to control, and sometimes it's very planned. Okay, very planned. So this is an example of France during the 1800s, how they expanded. So it's first there's one territory to another. So there's a wall as a boundary defining a deeply tied to an early modern vision of the city. So if you, for example, if you've seen Beijing, the Forbidden City, there's a Beijing Wall, right? So we're fascinated by the Beijing Wall, or the city that is enclosed by, of course, almost 1,000 steps where it's enclosed. So those are the things that you see as it's a forbidden city before. So they didn't actually they tried to preserve it because it's part of their history. So that's a deeply defining or deeply tied to an early modern vision of a city. In Marseille, in France, in the 18th century, there's a thriving port already. Like also in the Philippines, if you noticed, or also in the 18th centuries and beyond, there is, of course, what we call as the galleon trade. Right? Remember the galleon trade that opened us to globalization or to the open ourselves to the West. So that's a comparison. So Manila was already the city back then. So this is Marseille, France. And of course, you have Bath, England, which actually has a lot of architecture, innovative. And of course, if you've seen the Royal Crescent from above, usually in the map, so there's a Royal Crescent and what to be described as a circus in the 1700s. So as early as the 1700s, you already see the type of architecture. So we're always telling about urbanization. What is urbanization? So in 1800s, the takeoff is the first is Western Europe, and then the second is North America, Then third is Australasia, Japan, and then of course America and Asia in the 20th century. So these are the urbanizations. The first ever majority of the urban societies are, if you notice, it's in England, usually in the 1800s or 1851. And then, of course, after that one, there's a meteoric growth in the new cities of course, Chicago, Manchester, Melbourne, and expansions down to London and Paris. So there are also hybrids because these imperial hybrids, London and Paris, they are deeply connected to each other. And of course, there are specialization of functions, and normally problems come in terms of complexities in economics, the transport, the metropoles, and of course, prior to the mid 1800s, there's a rapid urban growth and overcrowding, crime, poverty, disease. And of course, one disease that was rampant in the 1850s is cholera. If you, I don't know if you've seen the history of as described in films like, for example, Les Miserables. You see there are a lot of people dying in disease, and of course, controlling the population because of overcrowding usually in that area in Europe. Okay, so just a circa that those were the cities back then. They were already highly developed in terms of course, overcrowding, and then of course, the crime and poverty rate has increased. So the population movements because of again migration purposes, where when immigrants come in, there are movements. So from the 1500s to 1914, a lot of Europeans have of course occupied the territories of the regions. Okay, so there is of course a slow slave trade in some areas of Asia. And then, of course, going back and forth from the European areas in the 1800s, and of course, in Latin and South Africa and beyond, they have, of course, seen the world. So the global population by continent in the United Nations, or as seen by the United Nations in 2006, were this one. So in Europe, there was an increase from 20.8 to 70%. And of course, in some of Asia, there is of course 64.9%, which is in year 2050 is estimated to be 59.1%. In Oceania, there's almost 0.2% or 0.5%, just only an estimate in the year 2050 or 2030. So these are the urbanizations or the migrations that are being broadly being seen by the United Nations in these major cities or global cities. Now in Hong Kong, this is actually what Hong Kong looks like in the 1800s and 1859. Okay, so when port cities like Hong Kong and Macau actually were created, they were very diverse and cosmopolitan in terms of the cultures in the 19th century. So when the Europeans came, or the Dutch came to conquer, the Portuguese came to conquer these areas, and even the British, they actually scoured the area or provide shown the area and seen its diverse culture. So this is actually the map of Hong Kong and Mongolia. So if you notice, there's a territorial or the urbanization in these historical perspective of urbanization. So there are treaty ports in China. So in Macau and Hong Kong, if you notice, Macau and Hong Kong are a special autonomous region in terms of course, a lot of tourists come in Macau and Hong Kong, and there are, of course, dual, it's a special economic zone wherein, of course, trading from all over the world are coming in. That's why it's an SAR. If you don't, I don't know if you've traveled in Macau and Hong Kong. These are special ports that are very influential during the time of industrialization, or in, of course, global cities. So why did they become global cities? Because of their contribution to becoming a city or to the world. So now we go to for Asia, from China down to Macau to Hong Kong. These are some of the growth cities. So of course, in Chicago, there is also a growth in terms of course, the population from 1833 down to 1870s. So the migration was very fast, or very fast growth because of course, the urbanization, and of course, in global immigrants came in America and New York. So there is a Chinatown actually in America. So left is Chinatown in Macau, and of course in some of Hong Kong, and the top left is Little Italy, and of course top right is Hester Street in the Jewish continents. So these are some of the historical cities that grew drastically because of immigrants, and of course Manchester, the what you call as Cottonopolis, as depicted in 1840. So there was, of course, what was, of course, described in a setting or scenario by a writer, a proficient sociologist, Engels, Frederick Engels, described it in his writings that he went to Manchester with Burgo, and he spoke to him of course, a condition in the people's quarters because of the massive, of course, there were still unplanned stages of development in these areas, but as time grew, of course, they are now becoming industrialized cities. So of course, classes also grew. If you remember, we have different classes, or that's why there are specification of social classes or demographics came into play. So the new populations are, of course, a curiosity, and sometimes it's a fear because again they brought in slaves from Africa. So these are the Boston sketchers in 1800s. This is what the Boston city looks like in 1855. So what the city looked like back then. So most probably those traders that came in from Europe and other territories plotted them slaves, and they of course dwelled in this area of Boston. So there's what they call a tenement, which describes the building of New York back then, where the city dwellers are, how did they become as they are now with the buildings and stuff. So if you notice, this is the first of what you call as a tenement life, wherein it's like a dormitory type, wherein families live in a tenement, and it's a building type complex wherein all of the workers are housed in one area, and that's where the one family is, like for example, in just one floor, and all of them sleep there, and of course condone there. Everything is there in just one area. So as the cultures or the urban cities transform, there are new complexities of course, environments, and not just people and buildings, but also infrastructure develop. So there are, of course, after the infrastructures, the sanitations and amenities and transit are, of course, described. So Paris is the capital of the 19th century, and of course, they become social laboratories because, of course, the response to public health, the policies on urban planning, and expertise. So these were the infrastructures that that were presented in, of course, in the late 1800s, going to the 1900s. So this is the London Pancras stations, or in the train, and then of course Claude Monet, how he painted a portion or a street in, I assume this is actually Paris. So Paris is, of course, as painted by or as photographed in the 1850s or 1870s. So that there was actually a demolition of medieval streets. And of course, the creation of new streetscapes, as you've seen here, based on, of course, a boulevard or an expansion of commercial and leisure pursuits. And of course, also parks and sewers were becoming a common thing in this in Paris. Also in Buenos Aires, and Spanish and colonial architecture were present. But why French? Because there is also an influence of French culture in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. Also in New York in 1800s, of course, the diversification of the modern cities were, of course, unlike in any other structures like in the world. Of course, if you've seen Paris back then or previously in the slides that you've seen in the 1800s, this is what they look like. Now, of course, in 1902, and there are now what you call as the skyscrapers. So these are the modern architecture in America. So there's a steel frame, there's skyscrapers, and of course the first buildings back then were in Chicago, the home insurance building. These were the first buildings to rise, and of course the Flatiron building in 1902. This is actually the Flatiron building was in New York in circa 1902. So if you've seen how the images are described. So the city, of course, when you say urban transformation, when you are transformed, it's called as what is the progress of cities during this era and after 100 years. That there's a, of course, built environments again, the practices, and of course the new forms of urban identity outside of Europe. How is the fusion of culture? Okay, so if you notice this slide is actually compared to the last one, is there is of course again these are societal laboratories because of public health, the continuance of public health and policies, and of course the sewers. How did they build the sewers and the subterranean systems constructed during the 1850s and 1870s? Okay, so they have actually it's called urban planning. So there's a planning and the subways and these are eminent. Even in Boston, parang sunod-sunod po sila because 1800s. As you've noticed in all of these descriptions, first in the United States is the construction of the subway system in Boston. That's the first one. And of course, the underground that you've seen previously was in 1860s. That's the first urban subway system electrified in the 1890s. Okay, so yun yung mga, there's a landmarks in their descriptions. Now, of course, in global history, when you see the global history, there is key factors. So when you see the vital lens, there are, of course, continual changes. And of course, these networks, the flow of people and money and ideas and power are eventually vital to us becoming global cities. So in the past, cities in the past are also humanity's future. So usually there's no going back because when you see these developed areas, it's you're not going back to, of course, the Jurassic Age or non-urban world. But cities of the future might be very different from what you see today or from the past. So, what are now the implications for the global environment? Okay, so this is actually it's the last slide, and these are the top 25 cities as described by the United Nations in the rankings. So number one is actually in 2019 and 2018. It's New York, and then of course down to of course London. We have their 2018, 2019 the rankings. Okay, so Toronto, you have here Geneva, Sydney, and you have Brussels. So if you notice, there are increases in the rankings. Munich, you have their Seoul, Berlin. So it springs up every now and then. Okay, so that's actually the end of the slide. So what do I want from you guys now? What are the insights or basically what have you learned in this discussion because there's part one and a part two and how does it affect your perception of the globe or the world itself in terms of this discussion, global cities, and of course our next this topic or normally it's going to be an assignment for you guys is try now to see or to describe or in our own scenario here in the Philippines, how now do we describe or what are the global cities here or described as global cities in the Philippines? And what is, of course, according to the global index, as you've seen previously in the slide, there's a global index. Okay, this is the global index. So, Global Cities Index is actually a measurement of rising cities. So, is Manila included in that global city or in the Philippines? How do we now identify, according to the discussion, the major cities, not just in Manila, but in, of course, in Cavite? Can how how did a city become a city in terms of course, the development? So those are the questions that we will dissect after this discussion. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Bye. Bye, everyone.